Thank you, Antonia. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, PEN. And thank you, Harold. I'll explain what this is later in detail. Harold Pinter said in a speech he made in 1970 on receiving the German Shakespeare Prize in Hamburg, "If I find writing difficult, I find giving a public address doubly so." I could double that again, or even quadruple it. I'm the most reluctant of speech makers. But because this prize bears Harold Pinter's name, I'm touched and honoured to be thought worthy of it. And I can feel it as a continuation of that warm encouragement and support I'd had from Harold during his life. I'd like to acknowledge humbly the kinship I felt with him during his life and that I feel now accepting this prize in his name. Harold Pinter was not only an inspiration through all his own work, but also encouraged me in my work, both publicly and privately. I feel that he's still sending those immensely generous postcards I'd receive. For example, when the Oresteia opened at the National Theatre in 1981, or my selected poems was published, or a film poem went out on the BBC or Channel 4. I've one that I'll always treasure that I got after the shadow of Hiroshima in 1995. "Tony, brilliant!" large exclamation mark. "In all departments!" large exclamation mark. "Harold." When the full force of the Daily Mail and Tory renter quotes descended on me in November 1987, and there were questions in Parliament about the broadcasting of my reading of my poem V on Channel 4, Harold was a prominent public supporter. These were typical quotes from critics and MPs on my poem V. "A cascade of obscenities," Teddy Taylor, MP. "Another probably bullshit poet seeking to impose his frustrations on the rest of us," Gerald Howarth, MP. "The riff-raff takes over," Sir Gilbert Longdon, MP. And "disgusting. Surely no one wants to hear this tripe. Isn't there enough sadness in the world without showing this? Totally disgusting. Totally disgusting rubbish. Unnecessary and obscene. A torrent of four-letter filth. Scargill poem is the pits." That was a clever one from the Daily Express. What aggravated many, even more than the language I'd used, was that they thought I dedicated the poem to Arthur Scargill, the leader of the Miners' Union. I hadn't dedicated the poem, but what I'd done was to quote from an interview that Scargill gave to the Sunday Times in 1982, and I used it as an epigraph to the poem. Speaking of his father, Arthur Scargill said, "My father still reads the dictionary every day. He says your life depends on your power to master words." Mastering words is an important struggle. It's been my struggle most of my life, and I witnessed it early in my two uncles that I celebrate in my poem Heredity. How you became a poet's a mystery. Wherever did you get your talent from? I say, I had two uncles, Joe and Harry. One was a stammerer, the other dumb. My Uncle Joe, who lived with us when I was a kid, had the worst stammer I've ever seen in anyone. But he worked at a printer's in Leeds and could set type brilliantly fast without a single falter. His jaws would stick on a consonant for so long that the balked energy would go through his whole body and make him stamp his feet. But as a compositor, he was astonishingly fluent. My Uncle Harry deaf and dumb, was a window cleaner in Ilkley, and he wielded a thick Funk and Wagnall's dictionary in one hand and pointing to the word he wanted with the other when I didn't have enough fluency in sign language. The boards of the dictionary were long ripped off. The pages were of tattered India paper. He licked his fingers frequently so as to be able to flick through the pages fast. And a little of the ink of the lexicon darkened his defiant digit. The defiance was always directed against what he called, with 2 jabs at the brandished dictionary, Tory error. I heard a phrase on a late World Service programme about the recent election in Afghanistan. The reporter spoke of women coming from the polling booth, proudly displaying fingers marked with indelible ink to prove that they'd voted. The Inky Digit of Defiance, the reporter called it. I thought that also described my Uncle Harry's finger, darkened by his manic lexical need. These early experiences of family inarticulacy were what drove me, I can see now in retrospect, into a passion for language and languages, and for what's still for me the supreme articulacy and eloquence of poetry. We poets acquired our inky digits, especially those like me who still use a fountain pen and notebooks in a digital age, through our own forms of defiance. The 2 inkiest digits are those of the V sign turned the wrong way around, or the fuck you single middle digit. And when Harold was awarded the Nobel Prize, this Steve Bell cartoon was published in The Guardian exactly 4 years ago today, showing Bush and Blair gloating over an award, which was a mounted golden hand whose defiant middle digit had the head of Harold Pinter. And Bush is saying, "Great news, they've given us the Nobel Prize for world statesmanship." The golden hand with the Pinter proud digit would make an appropriate trophy for this prize. Richard Eyre, who directed my almost banned reading of V on Channel 4, found film footage of Mrs. Thatcher giving the V sign, no doubt directed at the British miners, the opposite way round from Churchill's V sign in the war. But my choice of the quotation from Arthur Scargill was as much connected with my uncles as with mining, though the poem was written at the time of the miners' strike. My granddaughter, who wasn't even born when all the fuss about V happened, just received her A-level English reading list, and it includes the poem heaped with condemnation 20 years ago. And by weird coincidence, a theatrical version of V opens in Paris this very evening. Harold was one of the writers who prominently defended the poem and the right to broadcast it. His own poetry raised similar hostility. I admired the laser-focused rage in those war poems that I was proud and honoured to have read on his behalf at the Royal Court Theatre in October 2005. But of course, it's that rage which makes the poetry world flutter, unable to understand that there's a necessary poetry to be made out of political fury. I've had similar patronising responses. The fury of his polemic has been detrimental to his verse. The poems of Harold's, which raised the same literary hackles, were such poems as Democracy. Democracy. There's no escape. The big pricks are out. They'll fuck everything in sight. Watch your back. Or American football, a reflection upon the Gulf War. Hallelujah. It works. We blew the shit out of them. We blew the shit right back up their own ass and out their fucking ears. It works. We blew the shit out of them. They suffocated in their own shit. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord for all good things. We blew them into fucking shit. They're eating it. Praise the Lord for all good things. We blew their balls into shards of dust, into shards of fucking dust. We did it. Now I want you to come over here and kiss me on the mouth. Harold had great problems getting this poem published, as he recounts in Blowing Up the Media, an index on censorship in 1992. The London Review of Books, The Guardian, The Observer, and The Independent all declined to publish it. I've had similar experience with one of my poems, that it wasn't one of my anti-war poems. It was a Republican squib on what would be a loyal laureate occasion, the second marriage of Prince Charles. Legal ruling. Our future king, de jure, may be dunked into his spouse's cunt, no more his whores. Oh, let law make that monarch as defunct as Camilla's tampon after menopause. So apart from this, and my own problems in this department not only included the onslaught on V and its broadcast on Channel 4, but also letters from the Archbishop of Canterbury to the Prime Minister recommending that my film poem in defence of Salman Rushdie and blasphemy, The Blasphemer's Banquet in 1989, should not be broadcast. And on the 20th anniversary of the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, marked by PEN at the National Theatre in February of this year, the BBC chose not to repeat the programme for fear of offending increasingly vociferous religious groups. A poet's rage has as much place in his poetry as the emotion recollected in tranquility. We'd all like to concentrate on moments of beauty in our lives and poetry. Maybe small haiku perceptions of wonder, love, joy. There are such moments in Harold's poetry. There are such moments in mine. There are tender lines to Antonia in Harold's poetry and tender lines to Sian in mine. Harold called my poetry once outrageous and abrasive, but added that my family poems were immeasurably tender. And I do sit at my desk and I write. I look at my apple trees, my fig trees, my mulberry trees, and want so much to make poems from them. But as Brecht wrote in No Time for Poetry, inside me contend delight at the apple tree in blossom and horror at the house painter's speeches, but only the second drives me to my desk. The same tension between delight and horror, between blossoms and dangerous political bullshit, must exist in us all. At the time when my delight was in my apple trees, whose fruits I stored and live on during the winter, sliced into my porridge, many of the horrors came from Blair, Bush, and their coalition cohorts, and the illegal occupation of Iraq. But I do try to write about my apple trees. And in fact, I was writing about my apple trees and about love in a poem which was called October 2006. This ladder creaks. Take that ring off I bought for you in Gdansk, first token of my growing love, with a 40-million-year-old fly embalmed in its amber, resin oozed before man, not to bruise the apples I dropped for you to catch from the bramley I planted after that Polish trip. I was tinkering with this poem when I heard Jeff Hoon saying on the radio that the mothers of mutilated children in Iraq would one day be grateful to the coalition cluster bombs. That drove me to my desk. I wrote 4 lines full of fury that I faxed to the Guardian immediately, and the poem appeared with a photo of a smug Jeff Hoon beneath an enormous tank. It was called Baghdad Lullaby. Though now shrapnel makes you shriek, and deformity in future may brand you as a freak, you'll see one day disablement's a blessing and a boon sent in baby-seeking bomblets by benefactor Hoon. But I have actually written many poems about trees, like cypress and cedar, for example, and about fruit, for example, a kumquat for John Keats or fig on the Tyne. And I've coined a word for what is my basic existential philosophy, fruitility. Meaningless our lives may be, but blessed with deep fruitility. Again, thinking about a long poem I've been writing on and off about my compost heap, I was again driven to my desk with the same ferocity when I saw the picture of the wide-eyed, beautiful Iraqi boy, Ali Ismail Abbas, a victim of coalition cluster bombs, lying with no arms in his hospital bed. This was PM AM. Why is it, Lord, although I'm right, I find it hard to sleep at night? Sometimes I wake up in a sweat. They've not found WMDs yet. The thought that preys most on my mind is the only arms they'll ever find unless somehow I get MI6 to plant them to be found by Blix. That's if the UN sneaks back in. Ali's in the surgeon's bin. This went to the London Review of Books, but I later extended the poem into Holy Tony's Prayer, which ends with Holy Tony imagining Iraq photo op with little Ali Ismail Abbas standing next to him, making a V for victory sign with his prosthetic arm, and ends with an injunction from Blair to the spin doctors to make sure they twist his wrist the right way round. I cheered Harold's naming of our homegrown war criminal Tony Blair in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. The contemplation of the apple blossom is continually broken by rage at political events. As Brecht says again in another of his poems to posterity, what an age it is when to speak of trees is almost a crime, for it's a kind of silence about injustice. We must never forget that here in our own country there's a lust for censorship lurking in the undergrowth that could easily be inflamed. We need wide-eyed vigilance over our freedom of speech. We must never be silent about injustice. For the moment, while Myanmar, Burma, Iran, China, many other countries monitored by PEN put their poets in prison cells, we put ours in Poets' Corner. I sincerely hope to be spared both. It's not that I shun monuments to poets or busts and statues of poets. In fact, I often make a point of seeking them out. And I've used them as mouthpieces in my film poetry, as with Heinrich Heine in The Gaze of the Gorgon. Heine had one monument in a park outside the Frankfurt Opera, which is used by heroin addicts to shoot up in. Heine's hair is covered in blood, sprayed from the veins of junkies when the injections went wrong. The other Heine was in Corfu, in the palace of Sissi, Empress of Austria, who happened to adore the poet. At her assassination, the palace was bought by the German Kaiser, and his first act was to get rid of what he called that syphilitic Jew. Statues are one of the ways I try to test the traditions of European culture against the most modern destructive forces. I even have busts of poets in my house. Before you enter my house, you'll see a brass classical lyre on the door. It's my door knocker. It marks the door into the poet's lair. What do you do with this lyre? The lyre that sets the key for lyrical poetry, the lyre that accompanies the poetry of the trees you'll walk through to the lyre on my door. What do you do with this lyre? You bang it hard against the door. You change it into percussion. When I hear the lyre banging on the door, I'll open it. The first thing you'll see in my hallway is a large 18th century bust of John Milton, who stares at me as I watch TV and reminds me of the grave and seriously committed role of the poet, and who, though he was blind, had one of the most unflinching and unswerving gazes of all English poets. He's one of my great heroes. And I have small busts of Homer, Dante, Byron, Strindberg, a framed engraving of Molière, Shakespeare, Kipling, a photo and a manuscript of Yeats. And there is also, on my staircase, a manuscript of Victor Hugo, along with a pressed flower from his spectacular funeral, at which it was said, the prostitutes of Paris, as a mark of respect, draped their pudenda in black crepe. I made a version of his Loisa Muse with a libidinous Victorian Prince of Wales and an obsequious poet laureate in his rowdy retinue. I often find myself quoting from Victor Hugo after one of my many theatrical ventures. Now that my play is a failure, he once said, I find I love it all the more. I first quoted that after Square Rounds in the Olivier in 1992. But I loved it enough that 15 years later, I redirected Square Rounds in Russian translation at the Taganka Theatre in Moscow, where it's still in the repertory. If the bust of John Milton and the others urge me on, there's also, watching me, a bust of John Nicholson as a cautionary reminder of what happens to a poet who betrays his true voice for the praise of genteel admirers, money, or fame. John Nicholson, known as the Airedale Bard, was a Yorkshire wool sorter who etched his poems in the grease left by the fleeces he worked with in the mill. He acquired the condescending appellation, the wool sorter poet. He drowned in the River Aire near Salt's Mill, Saltaire, in 1843. He wrote about exploited children in the factories of Leeds and Bradford, and then was bribed by attention and money to become more pastoral and more pleasing to his aristocratic patrons. I wrote a play about him for Salt's Mill in 1993, and it was revived again in 2003. It was called Poetry or Bust. Nicholson swapped his integrity for a bust that meant fame, acceptance, compromise. An old Yorkshire woman who saw the play at the mill said she had the original bust of Nicholson, it was in plaster, and that I could have it. She said, it's about as much use to me as a chocolate fireguard. So I'm urged on by the one John and served a warning by the other. And my house is full of more important monuments to poets. They're books. There are thousands of them in my house, from all ages and in many languages. There are ancient authors, especially the Greek tragedians, in hundreds of annotated editions. There are Czech poets, Polish poets, German poets, Russian poets, Italian, Spanish, Greek, South American, French, Sanskrit, Japanese, Chinese, etc., etc., etc. Poets who have been or are in prison, poets who have been murdered, poets whose books have been burned. There are signed copies by friends, like Wally Shoyinka, with whom I did shows when we were both students at Leeds University, whose crossing of the Nigerian junta resulted in his solitary confinement. Partly because of him, I spent 4 years in Nigeria. After West Africa, I also spent a year and a half in Prague, and I got to know that wonderful poet and scientist Miroslav Holub, whose signed books I also have. He had a long experience of surveillance and of censorship. I dedicated a poem to him that I wrote in Cuba in August 1969, exactly a year after the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. The Soviet fleet was making a very show-of-force visit to Havana. There was a torrential tropical downpour which brought down all the celebratory posters from the harbour lampposts. I collected one, and the image was used on the cover of the London magazine, I think it was for April 1970, in which I wrote one of my very rare pieces of prose on Cuba. I framed the poster later to remind me. It's large, and I've never put it up, as the Soviet battleship's gun barrels are too central and too threatening. The poem I wrote for Miroslav Holub was called On the Spot. watching the Soviet subs surface at the side of flagged battleships between Havana Harbor and the USA, I can't help thinking how the sword has developed immensely, while the pen is still only a point, a free ink flow, and the witness it has to keep bearing. Miroslav, you must remember there'd be no rumba now if the blacks who made Cuba had not somehow evolved, either when shackled or pegged or grouped for a whiplash harangue, together somehow with slight spasms of only the nipples or haunches, a calf muscle tugging the chain taut, the art of dancing on the spot without ever being seen to be moving, not a foot or a hand out of place. I went back to Prague during the Soviet occupation and saw Holub. I brought back with me, hidden in a child's puppet theatre, many recent anti-occupation cartoons by Jiří Jirásek. I arranged an exhibition of them. The front of the catalogue had Jirásek's cartoons of a Soviet tank with its gun barrels belching forth smoke, but read in Cyrillic capitals, Pravda. And among all these busts and these thousands of books in my house, I've also one of Jocelyn Herbert's Mass for the Oresteia that I did with Peter Hall at the National in 1981. The Greek tragic mask is one of my main metaphors for the role of the poet. The eyes of the tragic mask are always open to witness even the worst, and the mouth is always open to make poetry from it. Neither ever close. Along with all this, from my first film for the cinema, I have the burned head of my golden statue of Prometheus, the great Titan who gave man fire and the inwardness and poetry that came from its contemplation. I keep it for its unflinching, unswerving, even still almost hopeful gaze, staring from the earliest times into our own. I had the 20-odd foot golden statue chained to a kind of Caucasus I created in the appropriately named Titan Cement Works in Elefsina in Greece, next to the petrochemical works. The film ends with a conflagration that consumes the golden statue, except for the raised, still chained, though still defiant right hand, all its digits clenched. When the crew and actors had left, I found his burned head, which had fallen while it was blazing, into the quarry. It was completely burned and black, except for the two eyes, which remained golden. So though destroyed, it still shone with its first glorious visions for mankind. This charred head of mankind's first champion helps to remind me that the poetic gaze must keep unswerving and unflinching, as does the example of poets persecuted, silenced, killed in previous centuries and in our own. Yanis Ritsos, a great Greek poet, whose books were burnt by the Greek colonels in front of the temple of Zeus in Athens, has a poem about the eye of Geo Milev, the Bulgarian poet who was killed in 1925. Milev had a blue glass eye, and when he was arrested and burned alive by the police, all that was left in the crematorium was the blue glass eye. This is from the poem of Yanis Ritsos. His eye is being kept in the Museum of Revolution, like a seeing stone of the struggle. I saw his eye. In his pupil there was the full story of the revolution. Blue scenes of blood-stained years, blue scenes with red flags, with dead who carry in their raised hands a blue day. His eye never closes. This eye keeps vigil over Sophia. This eye is a blue star in the nights. This eye sees and illuminates and judges. Whoever looks at this eye wins back his eyes. Whoever looks at this eye sees the world. So I don't shun monuments to poets necessarily. And though I have to confess I don't care for it, I've even visited the poets in Poets' Corner late in my life, and more than once for reasons that I'll explain. And the last play I did for the National Theatre Fram, the scene begins in Westminster Abbey, where light from the stained glass Greek tragedian Aeschylus in the rose window falls on the memorial to Gilbert Murray, one of his most renowned translators, and brings him back to life. Though I have a great resistance to making a Greek tragedian an honorary Christian, like T.S. Eliot made of the Roman epic poet Virgil, this wonderful combination gave me the opening of my play. But I'd gone to the Abbey on an entirely different, quite other quest. I went to the Abbey and to Poets' Corner to search for the monument to Thomas May. Thomas May, secretary to Cromwell's Parliament and a translator of the Roman Republican poet Lucan, who committed suicide at 26 after being exposed as being part of a plot to remove the Emperor Nero, and whose epic, the Pharsalia, is regarded by Shelley, for one, as greater than the imperial laureate Virgil. Though I came to share Shelley's preference for Lucan and knew May as one of his translators, I first came across him as a translator of the Roman epigrammatist Martial, some of whose satirical epigrams I used to make fun of New York when I lived there in the 80s in a pamphlet of poems called U.S. Marshall. But the poem that May had translated, and which was my first experience of him, wasn't satirical at all, but a poem about Vesuvius. Excuse me. A poem about Vesuvius, a volcano I'd become obsessed with since the time when I made one of my film poems in Napoli called Mimo per ella non è più in 1987. I've been often to Napoli since, most recently 2 days after I was told that I would be given this prize. I also translated the same Martial poem myself, and I have it in my notebook opposite a photograph of a wall painting from Pompeii showing Vesuvius before its great eruption in AD 79. Vesuvius is verdantly green and covered from top to bottom with vines. My translation reads, Vesuvius, green yesterday with shady vine, where the crushed grape gushed vast vats of wine, ridges Bacchus loved and put before his birthplace nicer, Venus favoured more than Lacedaemon, and where Satyr stomped till now, and Herculaneum, all swamped, engulfed by cinders in a flood of fire. Power like this, not even God's desire. I put my version and Thomas May's version together in a long poem called The Grilling, which is a dialogue with the ghost of Goethe, who climbed Vesuvius 200 years before me. I use Vesuvius not only for itself, but for a metaphor for all the fiery devastation of our times, the power that not even God's desire grabbed blindly by men. I had to advise Goethe that since his day, the city of Würzburg, from where throughout his entire life he ordered his favourite wine, had been levelled by Allied bombing, and the special bottles associated with Würzburg wine, the Boxbeutel or goat's scrotum, had all exploded in the raid, and all their glass fused together, and clouds of Riesling steam rose into the air. I included my translation of Marshall's poem and Thomas May's in this poem, The Grilling, set on Vesuvius, and I'd gone to Poets' Corner to look for my fellow poet and translator, and I should say, my fellow Republican. But Thomas May is no longer in the Abbey. As Secretary to the Long Parliament and translator of the great Republican epic, the Pharsalia of Lucan, his remains were removed at the Restoration in 1660 and flung in a pit, and the monument reused. Behind the present monument to a sub-dean, Thomas Triplett, there are the ghostly remnants of a larger monument, which had been that to Thomas May. It had an inscription in verse from the Republican poet Lucan. As David Norbrooke says in his book, Writing the English Republic, English literary culture has never entirely undone such expulsions. Opposite this space where Thomas May once had his resting place, close to Gilbert Murray, and either insensitively placed or put there maliciously, is Gilbert Murray's cruelest critic, T.S. Eliot, the nation's favourite poet, apparently. The Abbey geography of the Greek scholar, translator of Greek tragedy, Murray, set between the inspiring stained glass of his Aeschylus and his most vicious critic, got me going on my play, Fram. But it made me look at the qualifications needed to enter that sacred and exclusive club. The official guidebook to Poets' Corner, or PC as I like to think of it. Sometimes a poet's lifestyle or politics preclude him from being given the Poets' Corner honour, then in brackets, until a new generation has forgiven or forgotten. For some, the forgiveness takes a long time. Shelley, who died in 1822, was refused a memorial because of his atheism and didn't qualify till 1946, 123 years. But he still largely accepted for Ode to the Skylark rather than I met murder on the way. It had a mask like Castlereagh. And when I got to Parliament Square, the mask had changed to Tony Blair. Oh, at least that's what it says in my edition of Shelley. Byron, who died in 1824, was excluded till 1969, 145 years. In 1924, the centenary of his death, a petition for an Abbey memorial was turned down by Dean Herbert Ryle, who said that Byron, partly by his openly dissolute life, partly by the influence of his licentious verse, earned a worldwide reputation for immorality among English-speaking people. It took Milton, died in 1674, 63 years to pass muster, and 95 years before Oscar Wilde got even a memorial window. But T.S. Eliot, who is critically sniffy about Shelley and Milton, and was a self-proclaimed royalist in politics, Anglo-Catholic in religion, and classicist in literature, only had to wait 2 years to get into the Abbey after his death. Robert Graves called Eliot the senior church warden to English literature. But I wonder what's going to happen to T.S. Eliot when all his known, reputedly pornographic verses are finally published in the complete poems promised by Faber and Faber. Will he be removed, dejected from the Abbey, like Thomas May? It was my obsession with Vesuvius that led me to seek the now desecrated tomb of Thomas May. And just after I had been informed I'd be the first recipient of the PEN Pinter Prize, I had to go to Napoli to read my poetry. The Italians have taken to my poetry far more readily than the British, if I'm to be honest. I have 3 books of poems published by Einaudi, and that gets me many very welcome invitations to read there. Napoli, I especially love after I'd made my film poem there in 1987. I've been there many times since and know the city very well. Sean and I always try to stay in the same little old-fashioned hotel. The rooms have a great view of Vesuvius. In the evenings, we eat in the Piazza Sanazzaro. Very close to the Trattoria da Pasqualino, there are the tombs and monuments to 3 poets whose presences have been important to me one way or another. I visit them every time I give a reading or show a film in Napoli. Near the Mergellina station, in a small park, are the tombs of Virgil and of Leopardi. I lived long years with Virgil and almost completed a doctoral thesis on him when I made a deliberate, defiant decision to abandon it. One reason was that I didn't want to become an academic and do poetry in my spare time. Poetry had to be the whole venture of my life. The other reason was I began to have huge misgivings about Virgil's Aeneid. He was, in a way, the first laureate poet in history, and his epic reeks of the compromises he made. I began, like Shelley, to prefer Lucan and his lament for the Roman Republic in the Pharsalia. Thomas May, whose ejection from the Abbey I've mentioned earlier, addresses Virgil in one of his verses and compares him to Lucan. Thou gottest Augustus' love, he Nero's hate, but 'twas an act more great and high to move a prince's envy than a prince's love. Next to Virgil is Leopardi, Italy's greatest romantic poet. I always read his poem La Ginestra when I go to Naples. I get myself a seat in a cafe in Mergellina with a view of Vesuvius, and I order a bottle of chilled volcanic wine, Falanghina or Fiano di Avellino or Greco di Tufo or Lacrima Christi. What Leopardi's poem does is to focus not on the vines of the martial poem that Thomas May and I translated, but on the bright yellow broom, La Ginestra, that still now covers the slopes of Vesuvius. Sterminato Vesevo, exterminator Vesuvius. La Ginestra is bright yellow, and Leopardi insists it doesn't grovel to any superior power, man or God. It simply burns brightly. It's partly a metaphor for the poet. It's like Luther's apple tree planted on the eve of the apocalypse. It doesn't have humanity's delusions of immortality. No religion makes it bow its head. Its defiance is its burning brightly, beautifully and conspicuously on the slopes of extinction. On the other side of the Piazza Sanazzaro, nearer to the sea, is the church Santa Maria del Parto, in which, if you go behind the altar, you'll find a bust and monument to Jacopo Sanazzaro, who died in 1530, after whom the square where we eat and drink volcanic wine is named Piazza Sanazzaro. You have a good view of the fishermen of Mergellina selling their clams and squid and all the ingredients you're likely to taste in the dishes at Pasqualina's or Ciro's or any of the other restaurants nearby. I was intrigued by Sanazzaro long before I knew Napoli. He transferred the pastoral with the shepherds of Virgil and Theocritus to the 16th century fishermen of Mergellina. These were piscatorial eclogues. The monument, almost hidden behind the altar, has a bust of Sanazzaro, which, if the altar and the front of the church weren't there, would be directing its unswerving gaze at Vesuvius. And as if to confirm this association, behind Sanazzaro is a painting with muses above his marble head, bearing a laurel wreath to crown his bust with, and behind them, the winged Pegasus, alighting not on Helicon to create Hippocrene, the fountain of inspiration from which poets drink, but Vesuvius, inspiration from your own locale, but from the most fearful source, perhaps more a scalding geyser than a fountain. The open eye of the poet has to keep the volcano in his gaze and even go nearer. There's a great poem by Primo Levi, who went as near and as deep into the destructive fires of our times than most, a poem about the elder Pliny urging his boatmen to take him nearer to the erupting Vesuvius in AD 79. Don't hold me back, friends. Let me set out. I won't go far, just to the other shore. I want to observe at close hand that dark cloud shaped like a pine tree rising above Vesuvius, and find the source of this strange light. Nephew, you don't want to come along? Fine. Stay here and study. Recopy the notes I gave you yesterday. Sailors, obey me. Launch the boat into the sea. But many poets can make no journeys. Some countries give their poets a corner of their own in a prison cell. One such poet in the Myanmar Burmese Poets' Corner is Zargana, which is the pen name of Maung Thora, who's recently been condemned to 35 years in prison. When he was in solitary confinement, he had to scratch his poems with a pot fragment on the floor of his cell and commit them to memory. I'd like, in all humility and solidarity, to offer the International PEN Pinter Prize to him, Maung Thora Zargana. May all those poets I've summoned up today make him at this moment the centre of their gaze and honour the prisoner poet for his still defiant poetic gift. He has a poem called Poetic Gift, which begins with an image of trees, but is not silent about injustice. Poetic gift. From the tree of my feelings sprang exquisite leaves, tendrils, branches, which awoke my senses and entwined my thoughts. And from the lines composed in mind came these verses, written in blood on blank pages with invisible ink. Zargana. Once I'd copied my notes for this reluctant address from my notebook where I write with this fountain pen into my laptop and was aware that I needed to hurry to finish it and print it out. As each page came out of the printer, the big bold type still glisteningly wet, I realized that my shuffling through the pages was giving me the same inky digit I remember on my Uncle Harry's dictionary raiding hand. This inky digit will always mean I've cast my vote in favour of the dumb or the silenced being the voice, of totally free speech and the freedom of poetry and poets. That said, I've also to add that these particular defiant digits become their most indelibly stained when I pick the ripe, juicy mulberries from the trees I'd love to have the peace and quiet to celebrate in poetry.